Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 2367. This is K-Swizzle checking in with my focus lecture for week 5, titled Crafting and Responding to a Research Proposal. And as you can probably tell based on the title of this lecture, we are devoting focus in this lecture to thinking about your research proposal assignment. But even more so than that, we're going to be really talking about how do you understand this research proposal to be something that builds towards the larger semester research project, given that it does act as the first step of that project. So on the agenda for today, I have 5 sections for us to cover. The first of which is a project talkthrough of the semester research project, where I will go ahead and expand briefly on some of the points I made in my overview lecture about what the semester research project consists of. Then I will transition into writing as baking, preparing a pie with a strong crust, otherwise known as introductory writing. And we're going to really think about the image of baking a pie as foundational for how we're approaching writing craft for the rest of the semester. We'll move from writing as baking to how to bake a pie crust, writing thesis statements, so that we can focus specifically on the role that a thesis statement plays in a research project, followed by how to write a recipe, producing a research proposal for the final project. And this is going to be where we delve into specifics as to how to construct your research proposal. And then we'll end with sample research proposals or examples for this assignment, where I'll talk briefly about some of these sample research proposals that I've provided for you to look at from past students who have approached this assignment. So let's start with the project talkthrough, or once again, the semester research project. So as I mentioned in my overview lecture, the semester research project consists of 3 steps: the research proposal, the literature review, and the final project. Now, I already covered this slide in detail in my overview lecture, so it's more so here just as a placeholder. But what I want to really get at here is that the research proposal, once again, is the foundational starting point or point of entry into the overall semester research project. Now, the semester research project is 50% of your final grade. And so the combination of the 5% of the research proposal, the 15% of the literature review, and the 30% of the final project is going to be what in total adds up to that 50% of your final grade in English 2367. Now, for our purposes this week, we're really focusing on how to put together a research proposal, but I wanted to just briefly explain the role that the literature review plays and ultimately spend a little bit more time talking about the final project, since that, of course, is going to be what this research proposal is helping you get your bearings with. So the literature review is really going to be an assignment where you will be conducting secondary research to support the argumentative claims that you put forth in the final project and that you begin to formulate with the research proposal. Now, the literature review is important because it's going to be a space where you have the opportunity to work through what are the main interventions from your secondary sources, how are you consulting secondary research as a way to support and provide evidence for the argumentative claims that you're making, how are you demonstrating the scholarly conversation that you're contributing to through your respective research project, so on and so forth. And so you can kind of keep in the back of your mind that next week when we talk about the literature review, we're really going to be focusing on how do you conduct research for a research project. Now, the final project is going to be, as I've said, of course, what this semester really culminates with, in that it's going to be the final assignment that you turn in for the semester, but it's also going to be taking the form of either a traditional research paper of 8 to 10 pages, or you can choose to submit something in an alternate format. So the prompt for the final project is available already on Carmen under the week 8 module, but I have included the prompt here for your use in case it's useful to take a look at it, particularly as you begin crafting your research proposal. But I wanted to direct your attention to a few things. So we know from the snapshot from the syllabus that the final project is a research project that brings together and extends upon the ideas from the research proposal, the research findings from the literature review, and peer feedback from rough drafts. And that we know that, with this final project, you really need to focus on producing a clear thesis statement, having effective argument organization, integrating at least 5 secondary sources, and provide some kind of an articulation of how your project makes an intervention in contemporary discourse on social media. And we know from the prompt of the research proposal that social media project should be really consciously thinking about how are you placing topics related to social media and identity or self-representation in conversation with each other, right? Now, the prompt for this project is pretty straightforward, but basically you're going to be producing a refined, in-depth final project that's incorporating the feedback that you've received from me and your peers during earlier semester research project steps of the rough draft of research proposal and rough draft of final project. And you'll also, of course, be developing a sophisticated thesis-driven argument related to social media discourse that's going to offer a minimum of 5 secondary connections to relevant research and will feature substantial close readings of the primary source or sources. We will go into this in more depth next week when we focus specifically on the literature review, but for now it's good to keep in mind that when you create your final project, it'll ultimately feature 3 sections: the introductory section, the close reading section, and the concluding section. And so for our purposes this week, we want to begin thinking about how do you craft each of those sections in a research project. And we will continue to return to this final project prompt as we develop these assignments each week. But for now, I really want to emphasize that when we're thinking about a final project, we want to move away from the 5-paragraph essay structure that many of you may have learned in high school and instead think about sections of a paper that are tasked with doing certain rhetorical moves and therefore need to be developed in certain ways that will ultimately allow you to get to the point that you need to cover in each of those sections. And so for the remainder of the semester and our time together, we're really going to focus on what does it mean to craft effective argumentation and what kinds of writing strategies can we use to achieve that effective argumentation. Now, in terms of your final project, I've mentioned this briefly, but you have a few options as to how you can structure that final project. Some students choose to submit a traditional research paper where it's going to be written in traditional essay format and is going to be pretty straightforward in the sense that, 8 to 10 pages, double spaced. It's going to look like probably every other essay that you've written, with the exception of not being a 5-paragraph essay structure. Alternatively, if you decide that you do not want to produce a traditional research essay, you also have the option of creating a creative project in which you take a different medium or form and utilize the affordances of that to convey the content of your semester research project. Many students choose to go this route because it can often be more enjoyable to craft a final in this form as opposed to doing a traditional research paper. But I wanted to just kind of briefly give you some examples of what your final project could be formatted as. So like I said, some students do a traditional research essay of 8 to 10 pages double spaced, but other students choose to submit forms such as a zine, a comic, political cartoons, a video or film created with Adobe Spark or other software, a Zoom recording in which you talk through or present your project, a YouTube video essay, a web blog or digital journal, a social media profile, a PowerPoint or Google Slides presentation, a podcast episode of 15 to 45 minutes, or a music arrangement of some kind. And I will provide you with some examples next week of what final projects that take a creative medium look like, so you can get an idea of how other students have approached this in the past. But I wanted to flag this for you now because as you're creating your research proposal, it can be useful to consider, do I know for certain that I want to do a traditional research paper? Or is it possible that I might instead want to actually do a creative medium that would allow me to explore how I'm conveying my ideas in different, perhaps more effective ways, okay? And additionally, when you're thinking about this final project, it can be helpful to consider what is the relationship between the content or message or argument that you're looking to convey through this project and the form or the medium or approach that you're choosing to go with, because that relationship between content and form is going to be really important for you to be attentive to, given that some of what I'm assessing you on with this final project is how are you taking what we've looked at and discussed thus far in the first part of the semester in regards to content and form, and how are you applying some of that knowledge to your own final project. So this is going to transition us into the next section of the lecture, which is writing as baking, preparing a pie with a strong crust, or introductory writing. And as I mentioned, we're going to really utilize the image of baking a pie as being our primary visual or image to keep in mind as we go about the process of starting to think about what does it mean to craft an argument, and how does crafting effective argumentation require careful attention to particular steps that will allow you as a writer to communicate your ideas clearly, concisely, and effectively. So I like to make the comparison that academic writing is a scholarly conversation that you are entering into. right? Thus far, we've been a bit more of spectators in the sense that we've been reading academic writing in the form of popular press articles and scholarly journals, but we haven't necessarily had the opportunity quite yet for you to enter into that conversation. You've done so informally with things like your highlight reels and your response papers and your real reactions, but those assignments have more so been, kind of practical exercises with getting your like bearings, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, on what does it mean to read academic writing. Now, in part 2 of the semester, we're going to kind of change gears a little bit and instead have you take those steps of actually performing and producing academic writing that is intentionally engaged with the scholarly and popular conversation on social media and its relationship to and impacts on identity and self-representation. Now, to enter this conversation, you must prepare an argument pie that is customized to the audience that you are writing for. One of the reasons I like to think about writing as baking, and the baking being a process of creating a pie, is because in your mind, it can be helpful to imagine that you're going to a potluck, a family gathering, maybe it's some sort of gathering with friends, whatever it might be. But what's most important is that at that gathering, there is food involved. And more specifically, it's an event where everyone is contributing something, okay? And so when you have this image in your mind, I want you to imagine that a scholarly conversation is like an event or an environment where it's necessary that everybody brings something to the literal and physical table, right? And so when we think about entering the scholarly conversation, it can be helpful to imagine that you're someone who's planning to arrive at this particular gathering and you don't want to show up empty-handed. So it's necessary that you have something of some kind. Now, for our purposes, because you're going to be writing, we're imagining that that means that you're baking and preparing something before you show up. And therefore, you want to keep in mind what are some of the needs and circumstances of that environment that should inform what you choose to bake and how you choose to bake it and how you choose to prepare and ultimately present it at this event. So this is the image that I like to kind of work off of when thinking about, analytical writing, scholarly writing, what have you. So I like to imagine that we're baking a pumpkin pie. You can imagine a different pie if you have a preference for a different flavor, but for whatever reason, in my mind, a pumpkin pie is just the clearest option. And then that way, when we bake other things in academic settings, we can refer to it as, a lemon zest pie or a peach pie or whatever it might be. For our purposes, we're thinking about a pumpkin pie as what it is that you're baking to enter into the scholarly and popular conversation on social media and its effects on identity and self-representation, okay? So if we break this down into smaller parts, the pie crust on our pumpkin pie is the thesis. The reason that it's the thesis is because the thesis statement is going to be the foundational piece that makes sure that the pie is able to hold its shape and stays together over time, right? The thesis really has the function of being kind of the uniting force for the overall pie, in that if we didn't have a pie crust, the pie filling, which is going to be this stuff right here, wouldn't be supported as well. It wouldn't bake properly, and it frankly wouldn't look as good, okay? And so we need a thesis statement or a pie crust to be in place in order to ensure that we have the right shape, an appropriate scope for the dessert. We need to make sure that we have a pie crust that's going to be sturdy enough to hold up over time and is going to be a good tasting crust that really, blends well with the pie filling. So when we imagine our pie crust, then we want to think about it as our thesis statement that's doing the work of holding the argument together, which works really nicely with this visual because the full pie is going to be our overall argument that we are contributing with this particular paper or project, right? So the full pie being everything that you see on screen here is going to be, of course, related to the argument that you're putting forth. You may recall from an earlier lecture of mine, I was very clear in saying that we want to be careful to ensure that when we're creating an argument, we're not accidentally just producing a statement of fact, but instead thinking about, an argumentative claim that could be debated and that not everyone would necessarily be in agreement over. And that's especially going to be relevant for our purposes this week in thinking about a research proposal that's based on presenting the initial ideas of an argument. Now, the pie slice, or each of these kind of individual slices that could be created from this larger full pie, is going to be the paragraph and claim. And the claim, of course, is going to be presented in the topic sentence. Now, when we think about a pie slice, we slice a pie depending on the needs of the environment, right? how many people are eating the pie, how big of a slice does someone want, how soon are you going to eat this pie? Maybe aesthetically, you prefer to see all of the slices pre-cut. Maybe it makes most sense to only slice the pie, once someone has indicated that they do want to eat the pie, whatever it might be. But for our purposes, we're going to imagine that each time there's a pie slice created, the size of that slice, as well as where it is cut, is going to indicate for us a claim presented in the topic sentence that relates to the larger argument, and more specifically is a slice of the thesis statement that is, of course, supporting this slice by way of the pie crust. And we'll kind of come back to this idea next week when we talk a bit more substantially about close reading sections in papers. The pie filling is going to be the evidence close reading. So that's once again going to be this section right here. Now the pie filling is the evidence close reading because if we imagine the process of baking a pie, which we'll start talking about today, the pie filling is going to, of course, be what's poured into the pie crust. And so without a thesis, we would have nowhere to pour the pie filling into, but also without pie filling, we would have nothing to fill that crust with. And so pie filling is beneficial to imagine as being evidence close reading because that's going to be where you're really diving into a close analysis of the primary source or sources that you're choosing to focus on in a given project. And so the pie filling is going to represent, the most substantial part of the argument, which is you really filling your paper with custom close readings that you are engaging with and producing based off of the primary source or primary sources. The pie decoration is the evidence secondary connection, and that's going to be these white kind of dollops of whipped cream here. I like to imagine that a pie decoration is going to be, the garnish or the things that you put on top of the pie that, of course, make the pie look better, make the pie taste better. They add some pizzazz. They enhance the experience of eating the pie, right? You can definitely have a pie that doesn't have any kind of pie decoration and still achieve the same effect of being able to eat and having something that's delicious. But the advantage of a pie decoration is that it's going to be something that really adds to that experience by adding a little something extra, right? And so by evidence secondary connection, what I'm imagining is anytime that you reference a secondary source, you're adding to the slice or adding to your paragraph and adding to your paragraph's claim by, kind of additionally supporting it with this dollop of a pie decoration that further enhances the connections that you're making or further enhances the support. And we'll talk about this more substantially next week. But for now, imagine that pie decoration as being anything that you place on top of the pie that adds to what is already there. And the reason why this is important is because we don't necessarily want the pie decoration to overwhelm the pie itself, right? We don't want to have more pie decoration than we have pie filling because that's a disproportionate amount of pie decoration to pie filling. Instead, we want to have a pie decoration that well supplements the pie filling without outshining it, because in that scenario, you really have the secondary sources getting more attention than your own contributions. And then finally, the pie tin is the conclusion. Now, of course, in this image, we have a pie plate. That is totally fine too. But the pie tin or pie plate, whatever you prefer, is going to be, the dish that you're using to hold the pie and display it, right? So not only do you have the thesis crust that, of course, is supporting the pie itself and making sure that it bakes correctly, but the pie tin or pie plate is going to be what is there once you've eaten through and sliced that pie, right? So you need something that has a lasting effect or a lasting presence beyond one or multiple people eating through the pie that you've presented. And so for our purposes, we want to keep in mind that a conclusion is important insofar as it supports and, kind of well meshes with the size and scope of the argument pie that you've baked, but it also needs to be something that we remember. And in kind of this visual, we want to think about it as something that stays there and suits and fits the pie well without looking kind of awkward or disjointed from it. And we'll definitely talk about this in later weeks when we talk about the importance and role of concluding sections in a paper. So to preview what the writing lessons for part 2 of the semester are going to look like, I've provided these 3 bubbles. So week 5, which is where we're at right now, we are focusing on a discussion of introductory sections in an essay. And so you'll find in the next slides, I'm going to really go into talking about what it means to create an introductory section and how that relates to some of what you're getting at with the research proposal for this week. Next week, which is week 6, is going to be where we discuss close reading sections in an essay, and specifically where you're doing, kind of the body paragraph work of an analytical paper and how that is comprised of both, the close readings of your primary source, but also the evidence secondary connections. And then week 7, which is 2 weeks from now, we're going to focus on the concluding section in an essay and the role that it plays. So what this really gets at then, of course, is that next week we'll talk about the pie filling and the pie decoration. And 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about the pie tin or the pie plate. And for now, we just want to really focus on thinking about the introductory section and what it is comprised of. So I want to remind us of the kind of preliminary steps we must do before writing, which are our writing steps, right? And so this is going to consist of watch and read everything that is assigned, reflect on material you engaged with, identify content and form elements in your primary source, take time to outline your ideas for the paper, incorporate organizational tools into your process, or, for the purpose of the highlight reels, some kind of social media tool. No assumptions made about what your audience knows, and get creative with how you convey your ideas. So the writing steps, of course, I introduced for our use when it came to the highlight reels assignment, but we can continue to notice that the stages of writing, or these preliminary steps as I think of them, remain useful for our purposes, right? In order to get to the place that you're going to be ready to write, you need to first do these writing preliminary steps in order to be familiar enough with the material that you're going to be comfortable and confident enough to put together an essay in the first place. Now, if we imagine this acronym that can be really helpful to kind of keep in our back pocket, I like to think of it as writing is a treat. And now we already have heard or kind of covered writing by way of the highlight reels. And of course, I just recapped them for us now. But I want us to talk a little bit about ISA, and then next week we'll talk about treat. So what is ISA? ISA is going to stand for 3 steps of the writing process beyond those preliminary steps covered by writing. So I is going to stand for indicate context and scope. S is for state your thesis. And A is for analysis, not opinion. And I like to kind of think about this as having a dual purpose. So IS or is can also stand for introductory section, meaning that you need to indicate the context and scope and state your thesis in the course of producing an introductory section for your paper. And then analysis, not opinion, is an approach that applies to the whole essay. So you will want to maintain focus in your writing by not getting lost in opinion statements. And so I like to pair ISA with writing, not only because it expands on that acronym, but also because when we think about indicate context and scope and state your thesis, what we're really getting at here is what is the purpose or functionality of an introductory section, and what should it really do to lay the groundwork for the rest of the paper? And for the paper overall, it's useful to remember that what we're doing is analyzing, not just producing opinion statements, because when we offer opinion statements, we're not necessarily in a position where we're really offering, an analytical reading that's supported well by evidence and close readings and things that we'll talk more substantially about next week. So the introductory section of a paper can be thought about as the process of pouring and mixing the ingredients into the bowl. Right? So imagine that you're starting this process of baking a pie. And the first part of your introduction, or the ingredients that gradually transform from separate items into batter and then dough, is what you start out with in the bowl, right? So imagine you're about to start baking a pie, you get out the things that you need. And so the introduction is really about getting you started with figuring out what goes into your pie, what are you going to mix together, and what's going to ultimately be combined to form the kind of basis of your argument and your analysis, right? So the intro is all of the ingredients that will form a dough, which will eventually become a crust, or the thesis. So remembering once again that our pie crust is our thesis is going to be especially important here. But the thesis holds together the argument, which again is the whole pie, and it provides the foundation and beginning of the paper by making the topic of discussion known to the reader. So when you're proceeding to, start writing your paper by way of creating this introductory section, what you're really doing is helping us to understand what it is you're baking and how you will go about it. Now, this should hopefully sound familiar because when I talked about the research proposal prompt in the overview lecture, I made a similar comment of what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it as being some of what I'm asking you to cover in the research proposal. And the same remains true when it comes to the process of writing an introductory section. You're making sure that we know what it is that you're baking and we start to get a sense of how you're going to bake it. More specifically, it states what the primary source is by establishing why the source is relevant, connecting what larger topics, events, or issues inform its existence, and previewing what you will argue about it. So again, the introductory section is really about getting us started, helping us understand where we're beginning, and getting a sense for where you're taking us. And this is where terms like signposting from so what are going to be especially relevant. Some sample ingredients of what you might find in an introductory section, depending on the type of project that you're producing, includes the following. Perhaps you talk about the creator's inspiration or motivation for developing the primary source. You might discuss or preview content details in the primary source, form details in the primary source. So that could be content, of course, being the message or argument, form being the medium or the way that it's conveyed. You might talk about the scope of your project, right? Like how substantial it's going to be, what you choose to cover, why it is that you're covering what it is that you are. Perhaps you cover the primary source context of how and why it was made. Maybe offer some creator credentials of who created the text that you're analyzing and what are some relevant details to know about them. Some people like to provide a historical background on the topics so that we get a sense of sort of what is the larger socio-political context for this text existing to begin with. A gap in the research or representation. Some folks like to have, an introductory section that acknowledges what's missing or what continues to be overlooked in a theoretical or other type of framework. You might discuss the intended audience either for your own project or for the primary source. And this can be very helpful if you're focusing on sort of the impacts or long-term effects of a text on a given audience. The content and form relationship, perhaps there's discussion in the introductory section about how the message is impacted by the way that it's communicated. Evaluation of effectiveness, this typically is going to extend to talking about, did the author successfully present their ideas in a way that was, compelling or interesting based on the medium that was selected. And then finally, the primary source, or discussion about, what is the primary source that's really grounding this paper and how exactly is the author of this paper choosing to use this primary source in the course of their analysis. Again, these are sample ingredients of the types of topics covered in an introductory section, depending on what project that is being developed. Now, beyond thinking about, preparing to bake, right? So to kind of backtrack for a minute, if we know that the introductory section is about pouring and mixing the ingredients into the bowl as the beginning of your paper, then the context is going to be where you actually go about the process of kneading the dough. And so the context or the dough is the act of combining the ingredients, the way in which you start to form a whole from separate parts with specific attention to the larger conversation your primary source is participating in and how your own paper also contributes to this scholarly conversation. So this is going to be the section of your introductory section where you're really covering how is this text in conversation with or related to something larger, right? It doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It's also impacted by other things, whether related to the creator, the time that it was created, where it was published, et cetera, et cetera. And we should recognize the term context from the rhetorical situation that was presented to us in the so what, image or graphic from week 1, right? And so the context is going to be an overview of the circumstances that inform the setting, decision-making, and/or concept relevant to your discussion of the primary source. It could be historical, cultural, biographical, political, genre, etc. Right? So the type of context provided in your introductory section is really going to be shaped by what are the needs of the paper. The purpose of this context section is that you're taking the time to ensure that your reader has all needed information to meaningfully engage with the argument you're preparing to state in the following sentences / paragraph, right? You're making sure that the reader has what they need to continue onwards in the analysis. By creating a context, you avoid assuming that your reader automatically has all of the information you had when you began forming your argument, right? So the no assumptions made part of the writing steps. You want to make sure that if your reader needs something to proceed forward in your analysis, they've got access to it by way of your introductory section. The elaboration of argument is going to be the final stage of your introductory section. And this is where you can think of it as rolling out the dough. So the elaboration of argument is the process through which you roll out the dough and prepare it for pre-baking. And so we can imagine then that our introductory section is this process by which we really gather the ingredients, we kind of mix them together, we knead them into a dough, and then we proceed to roll out this dough that will eventually become the pie crust. So the elaboration of argument can also be referred to as the thesis. Sometimes it's a full argument paragraph, right? But its purpose is to make it clear to the reader what argument you are making about the primary source. It will literally and figuratively hold up the close reading and secondary connections. So we understand then that the function of the introductory section is about getting us started with the pie that's being baked, but it kind of ultimately needs to build to this elaboration of argument, right? It needs to build to the presentation of this thesis crust that your paper really hinges on. Now, with the elaboration of argument, it should be clear how your thesis statement engages with the assignment prompt. The elaboration relies on the support of the intro and the context to ensure that the reader buys into your argument based on the information you provided up until this point. It really culminates with a thesis statement, right? So if we don't have the intro and the context that allow us as a reader to get our bearings in a paper, it's going to be a lot harder for us to feel comfortable and confident enough to find an argument, presented in the thesis statement as compelling, or to even want to keep reading to engage with the argument in total, okay? And so that's why we really want to make sure that there's adequate support in terms of the introduction with those sample ingredients, as well as the context, to be able to really move to this elaboration of argument effectively. This takes us then to how to bake a pie crust, or what does it mean to write a thesis statement? So if we think about a thesis statement as our pie crust, once again, right? The thesis statement as the crust is the result of combining the ingredients into a dough and rolling out that dough to prepare it for the pie tin or pie plate. Because as we know, if the pie tin or pie plate is our concluding section, we want to see a kind of harmony between the crust and the plate. Because if we don't have harmony, that means that by the time the paper is ending, or by the time that the paper concludes, right, the reader might be left feeling really confused or disoriented because they're not seeing how the crust and the plate are connected to or related to each other, right? So it's going to be really important for us that we make sure that we select a pie plate in the long term that's going to work well and not be shocking or disorienting to our reader after having engaged with the process of seeing this pie crust develop. Now, the sturdiness in terms of strength and durability of your thesis statement depends on how well you've combined the ingredients into dough and rolled it out into a crust. So your thesis statement is, in some respects, really only going to be as strong as your intro and context that precede it. And of course, the thesis statement, once again, is your elaboration of argument. You're really working through the process of rolling out that dough and then forming it into a crust based first on the ingredients you select, how you mix them together, and how you knead them into a dough. If you have done an effective job of creating intro and context sections in this introductory section, the thesis will be well supported and your reader is more likely to interpret your argument or thesis as well researched and convincing, right? So based on what precedes it, that's going to really have an impact on if this thesis statement is well received. The purpose of the thesis statement is to communicate in a succinct manner what you are arguing about the primary source. This argument should clearly convey an assessment of how effectively the creator of the primary source uses the medium to communicate their message, right? And so with your argument, you of course always want to be attentive to, with the primary source that you are working with, how are you indicating for your reader the effectiveness or the degree to which the medium selected by that creator is having an impact on the content that's being conveyed. So if we imagine then a kind of thesis statement recipe card, or, what does this mean in terms of step-by-step how to bake a thesis? We want to check for some of the following details. We want to ensure that it's located in the first or second paragraph of your essay. It must be within the introductory section of your paper, right? And understanding the intro as being its section as opposed to one paragraph is really helpful here, because depending on your project, you might have more than one introductory paragraph that's really establishing the basis of your essay. A thesis statement should also be 1 to 2 sentences in length. It builds on the batter and dough you provided earlier as you combined the ingredients in the introductory section and formed them into a crust. And so excuse me, when we think about this thesis statement, right, it's possible it'll be one sentence, but depending on what argument you're putting forth, you might need a second sentence to really allow for that follow through or follow up to happen. A thesis statement is also going to establish what text you're analyzing and who the creator of the text is. It focuses on a primary source or secondary source depending on the assignment prompt requirements. And to review the distinction between the two, you'll want to click on the link that is highlighted in blue. And so again, you want to make sure that you're really clear on what is the primary source and what is the secondary source. And we, of course, will talk about this next week when we get into literature reviews. A thesis statement should also contain evaluative terms that indicate how the creator's message is being conveyed through the medium of the primary or secondary source, right? So depending on what text you're analyzing, you want to be really clear in indicating for your reader how effective or how compelling is the message that's being presented by this writer based on the medium that they selected to convey this information. The thesis statement should also clarify what critical details you'll be close reading in your analysis. In doing so, it makes clear what elements of content and form you will be focusing on. For example, how a color conveys an emotion, how a sound signals a transition to a new topic, etc. Right? So the thesis statement should really present us with an understanding of what it is that you're focusing on, much like the writing steps in regards to highlight reels, right? Of thinking about the content and form details that you're emphasizing or foregrounding. The same thing applies here with the thesis statement. And finally, it should establish what the creator's message or argument is in the primary source and identify who the intended audience is. And so depending on how you construct your introductory section, right, there's a possibility that you may have already covered this final bullet point earlier on in the introductory section with something like, the ingredients in your intro, right, when you're mixing those ingredients together. But it's something that you want to make sure that you have acknowledged in some capacity with your thesis statement or intro section to ensure that your reader has a good understanding of what was the original intended purpose or use of this text and why was it distributed and circulated. So to think about all these stages together then, right? We have pouring ingredients and mixing the batter, or writing the first part of your intro by combining all necessary parts of your primary source and topic, getting us started by showing us what ingredients are you using, combining them in a bowl, and after pouring them into that bowl, really mixing them together to form that initial batter. From there, in your intro section, you then knead and roll out the dough to develop the context for your project and your primary source, or the foundation for the conversation. Now, of course, once again, with dough, you need to really knead it so that it's a more substantial material before it can be ready to be rolled out. So we want to remember that when it comes to context for your paper, this really signals to us that we need to have a substantial enough contribution in the context section of your intro section to achieve a kind of dough that's ready to be rolled out and capable to be rolled out. Finally, you then want to form and shape the pie crust by crafting your own unique argument based on how your ingredients, batter, and dough have combined into a crust, right? So you can't get to this stage of presenting a thesis statement before you've done this work of actually, pouring the ingredients, mixing the batter, kneading the dough, rolling out the dough, and then having it be prepped and malleable enough to then form the thesis statement that we need from the elaboration of argument. And so again, the scope of your project in terms of what your page requirement is, how thorough of an argument or analysis you're producing is, etc., determines if the introductory section of your paper is comprised of one paragraph or two paragraphs. For a shorter essay, it's likely that it'll be one paragraph, but for a long form project, it will likely be two paragraphs. So to make a good thesis, what do you need? You need the ingredients that form the introduction, the dough that forms the context, the rolling out of the dough, which is the elaboration of argument, and you need the formed crust, which is the thesis. So again, the introduction is really going to be about where you're outlining the ingredients that go into your recipe. The context is where you're really creating the batter that you whisk together. And the elaboration of argument is where you create this dough that you roll out and mold into a crust. Okay, and so you can't have that crust without having the ingredients that create a batter that then get kneaded and rolled out into the dough that then can ultimately be formed into this crust. I like to think about thesis construction also as a process of, in some capacity, a game of Mad Libs. If you've ever played Mad Libs, it's this process by which you have empty spaces throughout a paragraph, and one person indicates what word is needed to fill a space, and a person who's not looking at that page then gives out random words, right? So for example, if we look at this Mad Libs game, you have like adjective, noun, plural noun, person in room, female, etc. Right? And so the idea is that the person who is looking at the page indicates the person who's not looking at the page, give me an adjective, give me a noun, give me a plural noun, and so on. And so I like to think about thesis construction as kind of being like Mad Libs, depending on what you use to help get you started. So if you were to use a thesis statement Mad Libs, I provide 4 examples here, right? And I do this because if you're a person who really struggles with thesis statement construction, having some kind of template where you can plug in some words can be a useful way to get yourself started. So to give you an example, the first one, right? I have name of authors, title of primary source, effectively, successfully, convincingly, unsuccessfully, unconvincingly, meaningfully, ineffectively, pick one, uses critical detail, name 1 to 3, to argue / demonstrate / show / distort / represent / interrogate / underscore, pick one, how / that, and then argument. So in this first example, what I'm doing is indicating where you would place different types of information, right? So let's say that you decided to focus your final project on an episode of Ear Hustle, okay? And so what you could do then is, indicate at the start, if you were to use this first example template, XYZ episode of Ear Hustle, let's say, effectively uses personal narrative to, let's say, demonstrate how people on the inside are just like people on the outside. A very, bare minimum thesis statement, but you kind of get the idea, right? It's this idea that you're really presenting, the author / primary source at the beginning of the thesis statement. You're using some kind of evaluative term to indicate the extent to which this text is successful in doing what it is that it's been set out to do or created to do. You indicate, what it's using. So for example, I used a key concept like personal narrative that we've covered over the course of the semester. And then I make a connection between, that critical concept or key concept being used and connect that to what is the argument or what is the message that's being conveyed by this particular text. And so you can really do this exercise with, any text or, anything that you decide that you might want to work with for your research proposal and final project. And I encourage you to kind of play with these Mad Libs if you find that writing a thesis statement from scratch is really hard for you. This is why I like to think of it then as when it comes to writing a thesis statement, you're either producing a homemade pie crust or a store-bought pie crust as the basis of your paper. A homemade pie crust is going to be a thesis written from scratch, something that you come up with completely on your own. You kind of, try to put together words and phrases in a particular sequence that you feel like really allows you to convey what it is that you're trying to convey. Alternatively, if you're a person that thesis statements are just really tricky for you, you can always use a store-bought pie crust or a thesis written with one of the Mad Libs templates that I provide on the previous slide. Now, there's not necessarily one approach that's better than the other. Yes, some people have preferences where they want to have a pie crust from scratch, or some people would prefer the convenience or the ease of the store-bought pie crust, right? Ultimately, we're not really getting into the nuances of is one better than the other. I don't necessarily think one is, but the idea here is that you want to consider, for the purpose of your research proposal, do you want to work off of a homemade pie crust, meaning do you want to develop a thesis statement from scratch, or do you think it would be most beneficial for you to work off of a store-bought pie crust, or utilize one of the Mad Libs templates that's provided on the slide before this to help you just structure that thesis statement for peer review and for my review? Which brings us to how to write a recipe or producing a research proposal for the final project argument pie. So now that we understand that argumentation is a process of baking a pie, right? Or kind of writing is a treat and that treat is pie. We now want to think about how do you actually put together a research proposal? So thus far, we've really focused on the introductory section of a project like a semester research project. Now, I want to be really clear in saying that even though we covered the specifics of an introductory section, you don't necessarily need to have an intro section as robust as this in your research proposal. Why is this? It's because the research proposal is a sketch. It's a tentative idea. It's a pitch for what you're thinking of doing for your final project. So even though we have all of these details in mind, I more so wanted to include them in the slideshow to kind of help you get a sense for where it is that we're building towards, right? So when it comes to writing a research proposal, you'll be doing some moves that are, of course, engaged with what we've talked about, but you're doing so in a much more tentative, kind of rough idea type of way. So what I've prepared for you is a recipe card, and you'll see a recipe card from me each time that you have a major assignment. So of course you have a recipe card for the research proposal, you'll have a recipe card for the literature review, and then I'll provide you with a recipe card for the final project. And the reason that I like to do this is it kind of keeps with our pie theme, but I think especially it represents what's already made available to you through the assignment prompt and kind of shuffles the information around and presents it in such a way that's designed to kind of help you think about the practical step-by-step approach to get you from, knowing that you have an assignment to actually getting it done. And so to effectively produce a refined final project, we need to first consider all parts of the final, right? And develop a recipe card proposal or research proposal, as you will be doing this week, that effectively gathers and prepares the ingredients and outlines the steps necessary to bake the pie. Okay, so we're in the initial stages right now. In doing so, this allows time for me to make suggestions to your baking plan and ingredients before you formally start preheating the oven. So you want to think about your research proposal as your process of putting together your recipe card before you commit to the recipe and start baking, okay? So let's break this down into pieces. So you'll see that this file will be available to you on Carmen so that you can look at it as a companion piece. But let's look at each of these sections. So the recipe that we're baking for the rest of the month is final project argument pie, okay, or semester research project pie, whatever you prefer. But I like to think of it as final project argument pie. Now, the gathering date or the time frames in which you're going to need to be able to provide this argument pie to the people who will eat it are on the following dates. So the research proposal in terms of the final draft is due on June 15th. The literature review in terms of the final draft is due on June 22nd. And the final project in terms of the final draft is due on July 2nd. So we know that these are the 3 gathering dates that we need to have a pie ready to serve at. The time to prepare is going to be 1 month because we'll be working on this project from weeks 5 to 8. We're in week 5 right now, so we're really getting started with this pie baking process. There are 3 steps to bake this recipe: the research proposal, the literature review, and the final project. And so we are starting with the first step with this particular assignment. The tools that we'll need to use in order to achieve this recipe are an introductory baking demo, thesis pie crust, literature review garnish, close reading pie filling, and a conclusion plate. So these will be all of the different tools or approaches that we'll be using within the next few weeks to really put this pie together. But for our purposes right now, of course, we're thinking about the research proposal as that first stage. So what does your research proposal recipe card need? Meaning, in the process of developing your research proposal rough draft, which you'll share with the members of your semester survival group and with me, you need to think about, what is it that needs to go into your research proposal recipe card, okay? First, you'll need 1 relevant research topic made of new or existing pie dough. What I mean by this is you need to decide, are you going to use something you've already turned in for this class as the basis for what it is that you are working on your final? Or will you be making something entirely new, okay? So are you going to work off of a research topic that you've already started thinking about based on an assignment you've already turned in? Or do you want to work with an entirely new research topic? Either is fine. You just need to get a sense for what you'd like to do. You'll need 1 tentative thesis pie crust. So you'll need to provide a thesis statement in the course of your research proposal in order for your peers and myself to take a look at it and give you some feedback as to the sturdiness or effectiveness of your pie crust. You'll need 1 or more pie filling primary source or sources. So you'll need to think about what primary source are you going to base your project around? Do you want to work with an episode of Ear Hustle? Do you want to work off of one of the Instagram comics that we looked at? Do you want to base it off of a YouTube video that we watched? Right, you'll need to think about what primary source do you want to use. Your primary source could also be something we have not used in this class. That is totally fine if you choose to go in that direction, but you'll want to think about what primary source, and there can be more than one, but what primary source really is going to be the foundation for what you're going to fill your pie filling with in terms of close readings. You'll need 1 argumentative intervention. So what is it that you're arguing or claiming about this text and the larger topic that you're writing about? And you'll need one methodology or baking approach. And methodology is going to mean the how. How are you going to achieve what it is that you are setting out to do? So if you're deciding that you're going to talk about personal narrative and ear hustle, let's say, when it comes to your methodology, you'll want to clarify, are you going to do some textual analysis or close reading of the dialogue exchanges in ear hustle? Are you going to incorporate any discussion of ear hustle's social media presence? Are you going to talk about maybe a narrative strategy that you hear in an episode? Are you going to talk about a particular narrator or interviewer or interviewee, right? So methodology is really going to be the how, whereas the argumentative intervention is going to be the what. So again, your research proposal recipe card is going to need one relevant research topic made of new or existing pie dough, one tentative thesis pie crust, one or more pie filling primary source or sources, one argumentative intervention, and one methodology or baking approach. This section of the recipe card, which if I can backtrack for a moment, is going to be right here. Okay, so far we've covered this orange section and this top right section. This bottom right section is going to be perhaps the most useful part, I think, of the recipe card. And this is going to be the how-to section, or the like how to get this done beyond what's already discussed in the research proposal assignment prompt. So when it comes to writing your recipe, you want to think about the following. Offer 2 to 4 pie slices to your reader in your recipe card proposal. That is your sample or tester pie. 1 to 2 slices should focus on the reflection/purpose, and 1 to 2 slices should focus on the methodology sketch. So if you'll recall from when I discussed in the overview lecture about the research proposal prompt, right? You have 2 sections in your proposal. You have the reflection/purpose section, the what it is that you want to talk about and research in your project, and the methodology sketch, or the how you're going to actually achieve what it is that you'd like to do, right? Now, 2 to 4 pie slices is once again going to mean 2 to 4 paragraphs. So we know that in the course of producing your research proposal, you need to offer 2 to 4 paragraphs that allow you to discuss and kind of offer the reflection/purpose section in 1 to 2 slices or paragraphs, and the methodology sketch section in 1 to 2 slices or paragraphs. Okay, so you could do 1 and 1, right? 1 paragraph on the reflection/purpose and 1 paragraph on the methodology. That would give you 2 pie slices. You could do 2 slices on reflection/purpose and 2 slices on methodology sketch, which would give you 4 paragraphs total. Or you might mix and match that 1 section gets 1 slice and 1 section gets 2 slices. It's up to you. But we know for certain that at minimum, there should be 2 pie slices or 2 paragraphs in your research proposal. And at maximum, there should be 4 pie slices or 4 paragraphs. Now, in the first 1 to 2 slices of the recipe card, which is the reflection/purpose section, discuss what type of pie you would like to bake, why you want to bake this pie, and how it will contribute to the gathering or scholarly or popular conversation. You'll also want to outline a preliminary thesis crust. So this is the what you are baking section. So in those first 1 to 2 paragraphs, you need to cover what it is that you're baking, why you want to put it together, and how it's going to contribute to the ongoing conversation. In the second 1 to 2 slices or paragraphs of the pie, discuss potential steps for your recipe card. What texts will you analyze, and how long will you bake them? Offer 3 to 5 research questions that will guide your baking process. Now, this is going to be your methodology sketch section as a reminder, right? And so this is going to be your how-to as opposed to the what you are baking. Now, the reason why offering 3 to 5 research questions is beneficial here is this is going to allow you to think about what's perhaps your argumentative intervention or way that you're approaching this intervention in terms of the scope and structure of your project, right? So you want to think about, am I choosing to analyze certain details? Am I going to focus on some elements over others? Am I going to, maybe put together some visuals that help supplement this, right? So in the second section of your recipe card or in your research proposal, this is where you can really talk about, do I want to do a creative option? Do I want to do a traditional research essay? How do I want to approach this project and do so in such a way that's going to allow me to really engage with the topic and argumentative focus that I am talking about covering in my what you are baking section. If you're feeling lost or worried or nervous, whatever it might be, I want to just briefly mention that there are some sample research proposals or examples for this assignment that you can consult to help you get started with thinking about what a research proposal might look like. So I've provided a few options for you here, and they're all hyperlinked in the blue underlined text, and they're available to you also in the shared Google folder that I have posted with these Google Slides for the summer, okay? So what I've gone ahead and done is I've hyperlinked the text that says research proposal, and then I've also chosen to include the title of the final project that the student created, so that perhaps if you're interested in certain topics, you can maybe work off of a research proposal that's most familiar to or relevant to what it is that you yourself might want to cover. So to try to give you some range, some past projects that students have done include the plastic face of Instagram, Kylie Jenner's influence on body image, monetization in social media, the rapid and significant growth of TikTok, algorithmic trends, why they matter, racist posts, comments, and direct messages on social media, and people of color seen through a different lens. Now, by no means is this an exhaustive list that covers everything that students have done, but what I've tried to do is pull research proposals that scored 100%. And that way you can look at an example that really structures, the proposal around the two sections as required. But so you can also see some examples of, what do these pie slices or paragraphs look like, and how are they designed in such a way to communicate the sort of tentative idea that the student had before they ultimately pursued this project. And what I'll plan to do is then by the time that the final project comes a little bit closer to us, I'll be sure to share the final projects that these research proposals gave way to, so that you can kind of get an idea of how they developed from the research proposal into the final project. That is everything that I have for you today in English 2367. I hope that this was helpful in getting you started with thinking about the research proposal, but especially in thinking about the semester research project in this class. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, confusions, whatever it might be, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk via email, office hours, alternate office hour appointments, and really, I'm just excited to look at what you come up with for this assignment. All right, everybody, stay well, have a wonderful summer, and I will see you next time in my next lecture.